Thank you very, very much to Labour International. Thank you, and for those opening comments, and thanks for inviting me. And I should say actually, I lived in part of my work in engineering as a chartered engineer. I worked for a company called Nortel, and I lived in Paris for 3 years, and I was part of Labour International, and also we used to meet. The Labour Party in Paris used to meet every month or so. So that was one of the reasons why I was keen to do this. I know how challenging it can be to remain engaged in Labour sort of politics and policies whilst you're out of the country. And I think it's fantastic that you've taken the time to engage, to come to this meeting and to engage more generally. And it's also, to say, it's always sort of reassuring to me to meet members with a keen interest in both politics and digital, and particularly the future of the UK's digital policy. And in the 10 years, I entered Parliament in 2010, and our lives have been increasingly lived online, and 80% of UK adults use the internet daily or almost daily, and I'm sure we're using it now. Many of you will have been using it to be in contact with friends and family around the world, and have great experience of the issues that many people are facing. Social platforms such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter are woven into the fabric of our lives. And together with a vast array of online apps for everything from video conferencing like this to healthy eating, they are a critical enabler of an active life as a citizen, as a consumer, and as a worker or economic contributor. And the COVID pandemic, and I'm sure it's been experienced in different ways in different countries, but it has everywhere accelerated this digital transformation. We're even more reliant on digital and technical services now. And I spent 20 years building out the networks, the fixed mobile wireless networks, which have now become the internet. I spent 20 years building those out before I came into Parliament. And I believe strongly, that public trust and accountability in the tech and digital sectors reflect essential labour and trade union values, that the technology should be for everyone, not just as consumers, but as creators and generators of it, and drivers of it, and that is even more important now in the midst of a pandemic. And so Jo Stevens, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and we've spent the last few months talking to and listening to tech experts, entrepreneurs, third sector organizations, young people, constituents, everyone whose lives is affected by technology, which is just about everyone, because even those who are digitally excluded, their lives are affected by it. And we've been assessing and analysing. We had over 600 responses to the consultation I mentioned called Our Digital Future. And right now we're assessing and analysing the responses and developing a report. And so whilst this is the consultation is officially closed, of your thoughts and feedback can still form part of the report that we're writing. And the objective is to develop a digital policy framework that understands how digital works, and technology works in the modern world, and really reflects the lives of those, how to make it work in a way that reflects the lives of those we're seeking to represent. So, and I just, I'll speak for about 10 more minutes, and then have the discussions for your input into the report that we're building, that we're developing, and to hear what you think about how we should set out what the policies should be, how we should set them out, and particularly about the absence of the government's ability to legislate on this area on online harms. We want to give people the confidence and opportunity to embrace and drive the opportunities that technology offers. And so as a party, I think it's also really important that as a Labour Party, we show that we understand technology and that we understand it not as something that happens to us, something that which we are sort of passive recipients are, but it's something whose impact we can determine ourselves. And Keir, in his connected conference speech, when he talked about the 2024 manifesto, Keir said, it hasn't been written yet, but when he knows what it will sound like the future arriving. And I think that's sort of representing that Labour needs, from the white heat of technology, Labour needs to show that we have the vision of the future. We understand what's driving the future possibilities, and technology is certainly one of them, but we're not sort of passively accepting what its impact will be. We have a policy framework which will drive it. And so, that is I think you're all, as I said, sort of familiar with, I'm sure, with some of the social media platforms. And I think the central challenge here is that we have so little control over how the content that is delivered to us is curated by the tech platforms, because it is curated by them. The absence of regulation, the absence of control, there is still a form of curation. And social media can be a deeply inhospitable and sometimes dangerous place for both adults and children. And the foreword to our consultation was written by Ian Russell, who's the father of Molly Russell, who took her own life after watching many videos on suicide and self-harm and on the web. And he's a great campaigner for regulation, because self-regulation by the platforms has failed. And we need a common understanding of the principles which platforms and technologies should abide by to protect us, our children, our parents, the vulnerable, from abuse and exploitation. We had a debate on online harms on Thursday, which I spoke on, and it clearly what I said then was that government had failed us. This government and the preceding ones since 2010 have failed us on online harms in a way that I think is historically negligent. So the consultation itself sort of had, as Anne indicated, had a number of questions and focused on a number of areas. And the first one it talked about was innovation. So the UK has world-leading tech firms, but they're concentrated in cities and in London in particular. And we want every region, we talk about building an innovation nation. We want every region to have the tools to start, scale, and invest in the world-leading digital firms of tomorrow. And we know this government has got, seriously lacking in industrial strategy. That's one of the reasons why we aren't able to deliver a 5G network without using our high-risk vendors. So many UK companies can't access the skills or the finance they need. They're being bought up by foreign companies before they reach their full potential. So one of the key questions was, as we're building back from the pandemic, how can we make sure that digital innovation is fostered and grows and contributes to the economy of all our regions? And as the MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, I'm particularly passionate about that. And the second area is around privacy. In recent years, privacy concerns have been raised about the extent to which online platforms monitor, control, and profit from personal data. We've got algorithms using our personal data to make important decisions, of which the A-level algorithm scandal was just one visible example. So how we need to protect people from algorithmic bias. We think we need greater transparency on how algorithms control and curate the content we see online, which tends to drive more and more extreme behaviors because it's fostering more and more time, sort of eyeball time. And how can people have control over their sort of better control their privacy? We click on, I'm sure we all do it, we click on like 10, 20 times a day. We click to say that we accept all the cookies, but how much do we know what that means, and what kind of actual control is that giving us? And then the other big issue was digital inclusion. So the vast majority of us use the internet every day, as I said, but there's a significant minority, up to 10%, who are not internet users. And increasingly that inhibits their ability to participate fully, clearly, in social and economic life. So you should be able to interact with all of your family and your friends, wherever you live in the UK and whatever your financial circumstances are. We believe the internet should be a right, not a privilege. And that means providing people with the skills and confidence to use the internet, as well as having the necessary infrastructure and ensuring no one is priced out of important digital products and services. So how can we ensure digital inclusion? And then the Constitution also talks about the public use of technology, the technology in the use in public services. How can we make sure that technology in public services is used in people's interests? There's always a lot of, we need to make sure our government services are the same as the private, as easy to access as in the private sector, but there are significant differences. You have less choice when you're using government services. You have no choice, for example, you don't have competing health services which are accessible by most people. How do we ensure that the public technology is used for good? How do we ensure that public technology is not simply outsourced to companies like Serco? How do we ensure that we have that people's data, their public data, the data the government holds on people, be it on their tax returns or on their health, that is used securely and in the interest of people, but also is used for good. There's a great deal of knowledge that we can be gained from analysing NHS data, and I personally don't think that should be being done by private sector companies like Palantir, but I do think that we should be able to develop new treatments based on that in a way which respects people's privacy. So that's a sort of quick tour of what the debate, what the consultation was around. It's going to finish before opening the questions by saying, as I said, I'm a chartered engineer. I consider myself to be a tech evangelist. I believe that tech can be an engine of progress like no other, and I believe it can improve the lives of my constituents and enable a more equal, more productive, and more sustainable skill-based economy. But people need to be protected and empowered to take control of their lives online, which is not what's happening now. That we see the online harms that have been allowed to develop by this government, because people say it was entirely predictable. It was entirely predictable kind of the levels, that the way in which the web and the internet would be used, for example, to groom children, sexual exploitation, how crime would move online. It was entirely, and I know it was entirely predicted because it was predicted. And we still, 2020, when Facebook is entering its third decade, we still have no effective regulation. So as we're debating and developing our response to the many submissions that we received, we will continue to work with Labour members as well as other stakeholders to develop a digital policy that gives people control back of their online lives, so that we can all, flourish and realise the opportunities that I really believe the digital era represents. Thanks. I know that there's sort of two parts to that, isn't there? And one of the things that really annoys me is when people say, "Oh, but technology moves at lightning speed, and government and legislation is so slow, and we can't regulate it in any way. It's global, so we can't regulate it in any way. It's much too important to innovation, so we can't regulate it." And I just tell you, that the amount of the excess profits that the tech giants make, a considerable portion of it is going into lobbyists and the tech lobby, of which Nick Clegg is sort of the latest and biggest member. The deputy prime minister, when many of these harms were growing, is now Facebook's leading policy public affairs spokesperson. So the answer to the question of how we can regulate the internet is one of the money. It might be the internet and the web and services may be global, but money is local. Money comes from places. It has denominations, there's currencies, and it is money that drives this. It is the revenues from advertising, specifically if you're looking at Facebook and Google, or from services sold, from goods sold. If you're looking at Amazon, and that money, can be identified, can be taxed, can be used for fines, can be. So there is, if you like, if the question is what is the nexus of regulation? How do you enforce the regulation? Well, you can do that through the profits and the revenues, etc., of the companies and organizations that you're regulating. The question is sort of more subtle than that. There are challenges to regulation. My last job before coming into Parliament was as head of technology for Ofcom, the regulator for the communication sector. And so, the communication sector was at that time, so 2004 to 2010, was growing rapidly, was challenging and innovative. And yes, that is challenging, but forward, that's what we talk about, a forward-looking regulatory framework, a forward-looking principles-based, so rather than technology-specific or saying, well, regulating this app in this way, it's about principles. And it's about being forward-looking, and that's why. So the duty of harm, it's a principle, it's technology agnostic, and that forms the basis of regulation, which you need a strong regulator, strong and knowledgeable regulator with the resources to enforce. And as if we ever get a response to in the debate on Thursday, there's many parts of that sort of regulation, how you define harmful content, how you define, the legal requirements, but it's not beyond the wit it is by no means impossible to do, and you've seen it done in other domains. Yeah, because these are great questions, and so talking about innovation, sort of regulation and direction, and sort of the flight path of technology. I think that's absolutely right. As someone who's both worked sort of in innovation and worked as a regulator, the idea that sort of too often, and the tech giants now are particularly doing this, talking about innovation, about regulation as being a barrier to innovation. There are many barriers to innovation, some of which I talked about: access to skills, access to funds, but also having an environment, an existing environment where so much is controlled by dominant players. I mean, such as, for example, the advertising online, which is controlled mainly by Google and Facebook, or search, which is controlled mainly by Google. If you're a small company trying to be innovative in those areas, or the fact that sort of everyone has their data on Facebook, what people who use Facebook, and you can't move your data easily and share it with people moving to another platform. So there are many barriers to innovation, which are actually about the kind of the existing landscape, which regulation done well can try and overcome, as well as, as exactly, sorry, I forget the name of the person who put the question, but, setting in direction and incentives for companies to evolve in the direction of the regulation. So regulation doesn't have to be a barrier to innovation. And it can also, for example, by setting out regulation early in open banking standards and fintech standards and financial services, that help make the UK attractive for companies who want to develop new products and services with a sort of level playing field. And I think that one of the greatest ways in which we can do that is where it's sort of first having a regulatory framework which protects competition and consumers, but also by setting down the requirement for standards now. So interoperability and standards, which mean that you can like move your data easily between platform. And once you establish that it is your data and not the platform companies, standards that mean that new social media providers can interact more easily with existing ones, so that there can be more and better new networks. So I think that I agree that that's absolutely what we need to be doing, and it is what a Labour government would be looking at. And I've worked on standards development, in fact, all across Europe, and it's something that the UK used to play a leading role in. We used to be very, very present on standards bodies, but over the last 10 years, it's become less so. On misinformation, I agree that a regulation doesn't address why people believe misinformation, but it's also important to know, to recognize that misinformation has always been around, and people have always believed it. I mean, you may have seen some of the cartoons about, the introduction of the first vaccination, a chickenpox vaccination, and the response from the social media of the time, and the fears and so misinformation and indeed conspiracy theories has always been around. I think part of it, and it's absolutely right that we need to have and certainly for the vaccine, for example, we need to have an education program and a public education program. And I do think that, that media studies courses, which have been much maligned over time, are perhaps now getting better recognition as helping to equip and enable, particularly sort of the younger generation to deal with some of the media misinformation. But I also say critically, where regulation comes in, is that the issue is that one of the issues is there's no sort of grit in the wheels of spreading misinformation. And it's much faster to spread misinformation than to spread information, because misinformation doesn't need to be checked or verified. And because it's so sort of easy to click on share, and because the platforms have deny all responsibility for what is shared, and because their algorithms and business models mean that you have to get more sort of sensationalist in order to attract eyeballs for longer and longer. And the algorithms, the studies have shown, for example, in grooming, for terrorist grooming, that you click on something innocuous, and you will be encouraged to go to more and more extreme things, because the algorithms are looking for more and more sort of attention span. So there is a role for regulation, and there is a role for responsibility as well. And the government is touting the fact that it got the social media companies to agree not to directly profit from misinformation, but their whole business models are based on algorithms that support and drive business models, and that's something that needs to be looked at. And I think in particular that idea of putting sort of grit in the misinformation engine. And then in terms of who owns tech, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the statistics that is really revealing is that, and this is for the UK, the e-commerce, online retail market, because of the pandemic, it's gone up by £5 billion. Not surprisingly, we spent 5 billion more on online e-commerce in the pandemic. 2 billion of that, so 40% went to Amazon, and Jeff Bezos's personal fortune, so not the worth of his company, the owner of Amazon, but his personal fortune has gone up by 74 billion during the pandemic. And the reason why the US stock market has not sort of gone down as you might expect, given that it's facing all these challenges, is because the big tech companies, the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, and Amazon have they've profited effectively from the pandemic. And so we need the government did introduce a digital services tax, a 2% levy in April, which is sort of a small step, which is already being undermined by the trade negotiations with the US. And it'll be interesting to see if that digital services tax remains. So I do I think we need to make it a more level playing field, for example, between retail and the real high street and online retail, and we do need to address the issue of ownership and owner of data. But I would the idea that open source is good, and Microsoft have many issues with Microsoft, and I've had many issues with them, and they've been found guilty of dominant behavior a number of times by the European Union, going back some time, not recently. But Google Android is open source. Android is effective, but Android is effectively controlled. Unfortunately, it's open source, but it's controlled effectively. The versions which are on the phones are controlled effectively by Google, and they do promote Google Play Store, for example, with purchases in line. What is free, and you see that with services like Facebook, etc. What is free is not necessarily, so Microsoft you pay for. But what is free is not necessarily really free. And so I'm a strong supporter of open source, but actually not so much because on the cost of it, but because it promotes and delivers interoperability and open standards, and also open review. But in terms of addressing the model of the structural challenges in the business models of technology, we need to look at what is free as well as what is paid for. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of questions there. The policy of free broadband for everyone, which I'll be quite honest with you, it was announced during the election, and I had nothing to do with it. And the shadow minister at the time for digital, Liam Byrne, had no involvement in it either. And that investment commitment is not something that the Labour, we're reviewing all investment commitments, and it's not something. It's my understanding. It's not something that it's not an investment commitment that has been recommitted to, as it were. It's a significant commitment, and we're reviewing kind of all the investment commitments, and the Ed Miliband's announcement this last week about investment in green industries, and that's an example of one. I mean, of a commitment that we're making now. Delivering broadband we do have a commitment. We need to, as I talked about, to closing the digital divide, and so delivering broadband to communities which don't have it, particularly don't have it now, and which are hard to reach, and which the market won't reach. That is something that we're committed to. Free broadband for all. I think in terms of assessing the cost versus the benefits of it, I wasn't convinced by the assessment, to be honest with you, because whilst we do need to have access to broadband for all, it isn't the thing that actually that. The challenge is, and it needs to be affordable access. The challenge is often the people's skills to be able to use that. Once it is affordable, and the cost of delivering free broadband to everyone when we have broadband which covers 80-90% already, and taking on that cost. There is a need to look at the way in which Openreach supports delivery of services across the country, but taking on the liability of ownership of all the underlying broadband networks, I personally don't think it's the best use of public money. But the commitment to access to broadband for everyone, and broadband, or rather digital as a right, not a priority, not a privilege, is something that I'm absolutely committed to. just on that last one, there are. I mean, I get an email on a daily basis from a tech firm telling me about their social involvement. You know, whether it's providing free training for small businesses or coding for schools, etc., which is great. And I do believe that, you know, I think that schools in my constituency want the support of tech companies, you know, and I think that's great. But it doesn't get them out of paying taxes. You know, that taxes are the contribution to the economy and society that all corporate and individual citizens have to make. You know, and I do think there also needs to be more coordination so that the school in my constituency knows where it can go to, rather than just having all these letters and emails coming from different companies. You know, there needs to be sort of one place that a school can go to could know. So I don't think Europe should develop its own internet system, but I do think, you know, European Union is a significant force for effective and better regulation, and we've seen that with data. And data standards such as they are, you know, data protection such as it is, would not be where it is was it not for the European Union. I've got a couple more minutes, so if you have any questions. Oh, quantum node. Yeah, I mean, I should say that Angela Rayner, who's leading the sort of review of our, you know, campaigning and other capabilities, is really looking at digital, and we've got a great digital team on board, and we are looking at sort of data, and you know, not only Dominic Cummings, who's interested in data, but from a, you know, positive and legal and privacy side, but looking at understanding our own data in terms of our campaigning, etc. We're doing a lot of work on that. I'm not sure what the infrastructure is. Oh, and Saudi Arabia, we need to have and Emily Thornbury and Lisa Nandi are really strong on this. We have to have a kind of ethical policy in terms of our exports when it comes to selling surveillance tech to Saudi Arabia, but also actually when it comes to many tech firms who may have slavery, have modern day slavery in their supply chains. And we are very much looking at the supply chains and having reporting on supply chains and transparent supply chains, so we can understand that. You did miss the beginning of the presentation where I talked for some time about the intention and the desire. The reason we're doing this consultation is to say that technology is not something that happens to us. Technology is not something that happens to us. You know, technology is something that where we and people need to be empowered to take the decisions about how it impacts us and what the impact is. And we did have a conversation about the way in which regulation can sort of set the incentives to tech companies, as well as empowering people. It can also set the incentives to develop the sort of technology which reflects, you know, the kind of future. That's why the consultation is called Our Digital Future People Want. The other thing I must say before I go is that also that whilst technology is developed almost exclusively by a narrow segment of population, by almost exclusively male and driven primarily from the Silicon Valley, it can't reflect the needs of humanity whilst it's developed by such a narrow portion of humanity. And we need a much more diverse technological tech sector as well. Okay, great. Is that? I think actually, hopefully you can. Let me put the questions, or you know, you want to follow what's happening. I'm just putting my email in the chat because you know, this is a debate where sort of, and the last question just shows that where people need to be involved in this. We're not going to get the kind of effective regulation that we need if people aren't involved in deciding what should be the principles, what should be, you know, what kind of how much control do we want to give tech companies, and how do we ensure that people are in control. So having that broader debate is really, really important. And so, you know, ideas and suggestions and ways to engage would be really much appreciated.